I noticed the quiet first. Not the reason. Just the quiet. There are small absences you don't recognize right away. Little things that used to belong to both of you but slowly become yours alone. A chair that stays empty longer than it used to. Conversations that used to happen automatically but now require effort. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful, just unfinished. At first, I thought it was normal. People get busy. People change routines. Life settles into different rhythms over time. When you've built enough years together, you learn not to panic over every small shift. At least that's what I told myself. But there's a difference between routine and distance, and I didn't realize when one had quietly replaced the other. What unsettled me wasn't anything dramatic. There were no fights. No obvious cracks. If anything, things looked better from the outside. New clothes started appearing in the closet. Nothing flashy, just different. Clothes that looked like they belonged to someone who had more places to go than they used to. There was a new energy too. More attention to appearance. More time spent out of the house. At first I was glad to see it. I even remember saying once, "You seem happier lately." The answer came quickly. Just trying to take better care of myself. And that sounded reasonable. Healthy, even. Looking back, I realize how easy it is to misread a change when you assume you're still part of it. Because that was the real shift I didn't see. Things were changing, but not with me. I didn't notice it all at once. It happened in fragments. A little distance here. A strange moment there. Nothing solid enough to grab onto. Just a growing feeling that something familiar had moved slightly out of place. You know how sometimes a room feels different even though you can't immediately tell why? That's what it was like. I would look at the person I had built a life with and feel a strange hesitation in my own thoughts. Like I was trying to remember something about them that used to feel obvious. Even our conversations started to feel rehearsed. Not fake exactly. Just, careful. Compliments would appear in places they hadn't before. Casual remarks that sounded supportive on the surface, but somehow didn't land the way they used to. "You work too hard," I heard once. "I'm just doing what needs to be done," I said. There was a pause after that. A small one. Barely noticeable. But something about it stayed with me. It wasn't proof of anything. It didn't mean anything by itself. Still, I remember thinking later that night that the pause felt like a space where something else should have been said. That was the moment I started paying attention. Not investigating. Not accusing. Just noticing. And once you start noticing things inside your own life, you realize how many details you used to ignore simply because you trusted the person standing next to you. That trust changes how you see everything. It lets small things stay small. But once that trust starts slipping, even a little, the same details begin to look different. That was the line I crossed without realizing it. Nothing had been revealed yet. Nothing had been proven. But something inside me had already started asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. And the worst part was, I couldn't go back to not asking them. If you enjoy stories about complicated relationships, betrayal, and the quiet moments that change everything, make sure you subscribe to Cheating Stories with Ray. Like the video, share it with someone who loves deep, real-life storytelling, and stick around, because sometimes the moment you start paying attention is the moment your entire life begins to unravel. If you looked at our life from the outside back then, you probably would have called it stable. That was the word people used most. Stable. It wasn't the kind of relationship that turned heads or made people jealous. There were no big romantic gestures or dramatic stories to tell. But there was a rhythm to it that felt dependable. The kind of rhythm that builds slowly over time until you stop thinking about it altogether. We had routines that belonged to us. Simple things. Shared meals at the end of long days. Quiet evenings where neither of us had much to say, but the silence felt comfortable instead of awkward. The sort of habits that don't feel important while they're happening, but later you realize they were holding everything together. At the time, I thought that meant we had done something right. Life had changed a lot since the early years. Back then there had been more excitement, more uncertainty, more late nights talking about things that felt urgent and important. Over time, those conversations turned into decisions. Responsibilities. Plans that needed follow-through instead of dreaming. Somewhere along the way, excitement had slowly turned into reliability. And honestly, I believed that was the goal. There's a quiet pride that comes from building something that lasts. Not flashy. Not fragile. Just solid enough that you don't question it anymore. That's how I thought about us. We had history. Years of it. Shared struggles, small victories, the kinds of problems that only make sense if you've lived through them together. The inside jokes. The memories that would take too long to explain to anyone else. I used to believe those things created a kind of permanence. Not legally. Not technically. But emotionally. The longer you build something together, the harder it should be to walk away from it. That was the assumption I carried without ever saying it out loud. I thought history made people loyal. Maybe that sounds naive now, but at the time it felt logical. We had already been through enough to know each other's habits. The little ways we reacted to stress. The moods that came and went with work, with family, with life in general. Nothing about our relationship felt fragile. If anything, it felt settled. And settled didn't feel like a bad word. People talk a lot about passion when they describe relationships. The early excitement, the butterflies, the intensity that comes from not knowing what comes next. But that stage doesn't last forever. Eventually you trade unpredictability for something steadier. Or at least that's what I believed. I remember thinking that the calm parts were proof we had matured into something stronger. That we didn't need constant excitement because we had something better. Trust. The kind that makes you stop questioning where someone is or what they're thinking. The kind that lets your mind relax because you assume the other person is still standing beside you. Looking back, I realize how powerful that assumption can be. Trust doesn't just shape how you feel about someone. It shapes what you're willing to notice. When you believe a relationship is permanent, you stop looking for signs that it might not be. You interpret everything through the safest possible explanation. If someone seems distracted, you assume they're tired. If something feels slightly different, you tell yourself it's temporary. Because the alternative would mean questioning the entire foundation you've built your life on. And no one wants to do that. So I didn't. I believed in what we had built. I believed shared history made us stronger than whatever small changes might come along. At the time, it never crossed my mind that the very thing I thought was holding us together might eventually be the thing pushing us apart. When I think back to when things started changing, I realize how easy it was to miss it. Not because the signs weren't there, but because they didn't look like warning signs at first. They looked like improvement. For most of our life together, we had settled into a rhythm that felt stable. Not exciting, maybe, but steady. The kind of life that doesn't make for dramatic stories. Work. Bills. Shared responsibilities. The quiet comfort of knowing what tomorrow will probably look like. I never thought of that as a problem. If anything, I thought it meant we had done things right. Then slowly, things started shifting. It began with small lifestyle changes. Healthier habits. A sudden interest in staying active. I remember the first time it came up casually. I signed up for a membership, they said one evening while scrolling through their phone. A membership for what? A gym. I remember smiling. That's good, I said. Probably something we should have done years ago. It sounded positive. Responsible. The kind of change people make when they want to feel better about themselves. At the time, I didn't question it. Soon after that, I started noticing new clothes showing up in the closet. Nothing extreme. Just different styles than what I was used to seeing. Sharper. More deliberate. The kind of clothes someone might wear when they expect to be seen. Again, it didn't bother me. If anything, I felt proud in a strange way. Like we had reached a point in life where personal improvement was finally possible. I remember saying once, half joking, trying to impress somebody. They laughed. Maybe I'm just tired of looking like I've given up. It was said lightly, and we both moved on. But something about that sentence stuck with me later. Not in a suspicious way. Just in the quiet way certain remarks stay in your memory even when they shouldn't matter. Over time, the changes became more noticeable. There was more energy in the house, but it didn't seem directed toward us anymore. Schedules shifted. Evenings that used to belong to both of us started filling with separate plans. Sometimes it was the gym. Sometimes errands. Sometimes vague explanations that sounded normal enough not to question. Just running out for a bit. Meeting someone from the gym. Probably be back later. None of those sentences meant anything on their own. That's the thing about slow changes. They don't arrive as a single event. They spread themselves out across weeks and months so that each moment feels too small to confront. Looking back now, I can see the pattern clearly. But at the time, every piece looked harmless. If anything, I tried to be supportive. I'd say things like, "Good for you. It's nice seeing you motivated." And I meant it. But there were moments where something felt slightly off. Compliments started appearing in places they hadn't before. "You should get out more," they told me once. Out where? I asked. Just anywhere. "You spend too much time focused on work." It sounded like concern. Maybe even encouragement. Still, I remember feeling strangely dismissed by it. Like I had somehow become the responsible one in a story where responsibility suddenly looked boring. There were other small moments too. A phone that used to sit casually on the table now stayed face down more often. Longer showers after coming home. More attention paid to appearance before leaving the house. None of these things prove anything by themselves. Even now, I hesitate to present them as evidence. Because at the time, I didn't see them as evidence either. I saw them as personal growth. And I told myself that relationships evolve. People change. Sometimes they rediscover parts of themselves they neglected for years. That's what I believed. But there was one realization I couldn't ignore forever. All that new energy, the excitement, the motivation, the attention to detail. It wasn't showing up in the life we had built together. It was showing up somewhere else. And I didn't know where. Not yet. But for the first time, the thought crossed my mind that whatever was driving those changes might not include me anymore. The changes didn't happen all at once. If they had, I probably would have reacted sooner. A sudden shift would have forced a conversation. Something obvious enough to confront. But that's not how it unfolded. Instead, the changes arrived slowly enough that each one seemed harmless on its own. At first, it was just small adjustments to daily routines. Later evenings out. A few new commitments that hadn't existed before. Nothing dramatic, just vague plans that sounded normal when mentioned in passing. "I'll probably be back a little late tonight. Just meeting someone from the gym." That sort of thing. None of it raised alarms. People are allowed to have their own time. Healthy relationships aren't built on constant supervision. At least that's what I told myself. Still, something about the rhythm of our life had shifted. I started noticing how easily certain conversations ended before they really began. I'd ask a simple question. "How was your day?" The answer would come quickly. Pretty normal. And then the subject would move somewhere else before I had time to follow up. It wasn't avoidance exactly. Just a quiet redirection. The kind that feels natural enough that you don't question it in the moment. But over time, those small redirections began adding up. I realized that more and more of our conversations were staying on the surface. We still talked about schedules, errands, the usual logistics that come with sharing a life. But the casual details, the ones that used to fill the space between responsibilities, started disappearing. I noticed it most in the evenings. There used to be a natural way we settled into the same room. Not always talking, sometimes just existing in the same space. That started changing. Some nights there was an unusual restlessness. A sense that attention was somewhere else entirely. Phones being checked more often. Messages answered quickly and then turned face down on the table. I remember once asking, casually, "Everything okay?" "Yeah," came the answer. "Just stuff from earlier." Nothing about the response sounded defensive. Still, I noticed how quickly the device disappeared from sight. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have. Not because it proved anything. But because it was the first time I felt like I had briefly stepped into a part of their life that wasn't meant for me anymore. After that, I began seeing more things that felt slightly off. Plans that changed at the last minute. New enthusiasm for places and activities that had never been mentioned before. Energy that seemed to come from somewhere outside the life we had built together. It was subtle, but undeniable. There was a kind of brightness in them sometimes. A lightness that hadn't been there in a while. And strangely enough, I wasn't part of it. That realization made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't fully explain. I wanted to believe it was just a phase. Something temporary. People grow, people shift focus, people rediscover parts of themselves. That was the explanation I kept repeating. But there's a difference between someone evolving and someone slowly stepping out of a life they used to share with you. The hardest part was that nothing had actually been confirmed. There was no proof. No confession. No dramatic discovery. Just patterns. Small inconsistencies that were easy to dismiss but impossible to completely ignore once you started seeing them. And eventually there was a moment, ordinary, almost forgettable, where all those scattered details suddenly aligned. Not a confrontation. Not a message or a phone call. Just a simple situation where I happened to see something I wasn't supposed to notice. The kind of moment that lasts only a few seconds. But in those few seconds, everything that once felt uncertain suddenly made perfect sense. And once that understanding settled in, I couldn't pretend I didn't see it anymore. There's a strange moment that happens when suspicion finally turns into certainty. It's not dramatic. There's no music swelling in the background. No perfect confrontation scene where everything becomes clear all at once. It's quieter than that. Almost ordinary. By the time I reached that moment, something inside me had already shifted. I had started paying attention in ways I hadn't before. Not searching exactly, but noticing things I used to overlook. Patterns. Timing. Little inconsistencies. Still, part of me hoped I was wrong. Because the alternative meant accepting something I wasn't ready to accept. The day it finally became real didn't begin any differently from the others. I remember finishing work earlier than usual. Nothing unusual about that either. Sometimes the day just ends sooner than expected. When I got home, the house felt the same as always. Quiet. Empty. I assumed they were out somewhere. The gym maybe. Errands. That had become normal by then. I made something small to eat and sat down for a while, telling myself I'd probably see them later that evening. But something about the silence in the house felt heavier that day. Like the quiet had weight to it. Eventually I decided to step outside for a bit. Clear my head. Walk around the block like I sometimes did when the day felt long. That's when I saw them. Not in some hidden corner or secret meeting place. Just out in the open. Standing a short distance away, talking to someone. The first thing I noticed wasn't what they were saying. I couldn't hear that from where I was. What I noticed was how they were standing. Relaxed. Engaged. Leaning slightly toward the other person in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. The person they were with looked younger. Not dramatically younger, but enough that it was obvious. Confident too. The kind of confidence that comes from not yet carrying the full weight of adult responsibilities. They were laughing about something. And it wasn't the polite laugh people give strangers. It was familiar. Comfortable. For a moment I just stood there, trying to process what I was seeing. I told myself it could be anyone. A friend. Someone from the gym. A coworker. But then they reached out and touched the other person's arm in a way that didn't belong to casual conversation. It was quick. Natural. The kind of touch people don't think about when they've already crossed a line. That was the moment the last piece fell into place. Not because of the touch alone. But because everything I had been noticing for months suddenly rearranged itself into a single, clear picture. The late evenings. The sudden energy. The new clothes. The careful conversations. All of it pointed to the same thing. I didn't walk over right away. For a minute, I just watched. Not out of anger. Out of disbelief. It's strange how calm you can feel when something important breaks inside you. Like your mind slows down just enough to observe the damage. Eventually they noticed me standing there. The expression on their face changed instantly. Not shock exactly. More like someone realizing the moment they had been avoiding had finally arrived. They said my name. Softly. Like they weren't sure how loud it should be. The other person stepped back slightly, looking between us without saying anything. I walked closer. No one raised their voice. No one made a scene. What's going on? I asked. It wasn't even an accusation. Just a question. There was a long pause before the answer came. It's not what you think. People say that sentence when they're buying time. We both knew it. I looked at the other person, then back again. Then what is it? Another pause. Longer this time. Finally they said something that I still remember word for word. I didn't plan for this to happen. Not denial. Not explanation. Just admission wrapped in hesitation. That was when the truth stopped being abstract. The affair wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was standing right in front of me. I wish I could say I felt rage. But what I felt instead was something heavier. Understanding. Not approval. Not forgiveness. Just the quiet realization of what this situation actually meant. I looked at the other person again. Younger. Carefree. Someone who hadn't spent years building the life I thought we were protecting together. And suddenly it made sense. This wasn't just about attraction. It was about time. About someone trying to step outside the version of life we had built and return to a version that felt lighter. Later, when we talked privately, they tried to explain it. I just wanted to feel alive again. That was the word they used. Alive. As if the years we had spent building stability together had somehow turned into something suffocating. I listened. Nodded. Tried to process it. But the part that stayed with me wasn't the explanation. It was the realization that I had slowly become something in their life that represented responsibility. Routine. History. And the person standing next to them represented something else entirely. Freedom from all of that. In that moment, I understood something painful. I hadn't been replaced by someone better. I had been replaced by someone who didn't carry the same weight of shared years. Someone who still felt new. And once you realize that, you also realize how difficult it is for history to compete with novelty. After that day, nothing returned to normal. I think part of me expected some kind of immediate collapse. A dramatic ending. Raised voices. Doors closing. But that isn't how it happened. Instead, everything stretched out in an uncomfortable middle space where the truth was known, but the life around it kept pretending it could still function. We went home separately that evening. Not because anyone said we should. It just happened that way. When I walked into the house later, everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The same furniture. The same quiet rooms. The same life we had built piece by piece over the years. And yet the place felt unfamiliar. Like I had stepped into a version of my own life that someone else had rearranged while I was gone. They arrived later. Neither of us knew how to begin the conversation. Eventually they spoke first. I was going to tell you. It wasn't said defensively. Just tired. I sat across from them and asked the only question that felt honest. When? There was a long pause before the answer came. I don't know. That answer told me more than any explanation could. It meant the line had been crossed long before that afternoon. Long before the moment I happened to see it. In a way, the relationship we thought we had been living in was already gone. We just hadn't admitted it yet. Over the next few days we had several conversations that circled the same ideas without ever resolving anything. They said they hadn't planned for things to go this far. They said it had started casually. They said they didn't know how it turned into something serious. Every explanation sounded believable on the surface. And somehow none of them made the situation easier to understand. At one point I asked directly, "Do you want to leave?" They didn't answer right away. "I don't know what I want," they said eventually. That uncertainty hung in the air between us. Because the truth was obvious even if the words hadn't been spoken yet. Emotionally, they had already stepped away from the life we built together. What remained was just the structure. Shared space. Shared responsibilities. Shared history. But history doesn't hold people in place the way we imagine it does. Once someone starts imagining a different version of their life, the one they're currently living can start to feel like a limitation instead of an achievement. That was the shift I was witnessing. The stability I had always been proud of, the routines, the responsibilities, the years spent building something dependable, had quietly become the thing they wanted distance from. And there was no argument I could make that would change how they felt about that. We tried, briefly, to talk about repairing things. Counseling was mentioned once. So was taking time apart. But those conversations felt strangely hollow. Not because we were unwilling to try. But because both of us understood something neither of us wanted to say out loud. Repair only works when both people are trying to rebuild the same thing. And it had become clear that we weren't. Some evenings we sat in the same room and spoke politely about practical matters, work schedules, bills, small tasks that still needed to be handled. Other evenings the silence was heavier. Not angry. Just final. Like two people slowly realizing they had reached the end of something that had actually ended much earlier. The hardest realization wasn't that there was another person involved. It was understanding that the emotional departure had happened long before the discovery. By the time I saw the truth, the decision had already been unfolding quietly for months. I was just the last one to acknowledge it. If you've ever experienced the moment when a relationship slowly comes apart in ways you didn't see coming, you probably understand how confusing that space can be. And if stories about real relationships, betrayal, and emotional turning points interest you, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe to Cheating Stories with Ray, like the video, and share it with someone who appreciates thoughtful storytelling about complicated relationships. Because sometimes the most painful part of betrayal isn't the moment you discover it. It's realizing how long it had already been happening before you ever saw the signs. After the truth came out, life didn't end in some dramatic way. It just changed shape. At first there were practical conversations. The kind people have when a shared life suddenly needs to be separated into two smaller ones. Who would stay where? What needed to be divided? What could wait? None of those discussions were particularly emotional. In a strange way, they felt almost administrative. Like we were managing the closure of something that had already stopped functioning. What surprised me most during that time was how little anger I felt toward the other person involved. I barely knew them. They hadn't promised me anything. They hadn't built a life with me or shared years of responsibility. In a way, they were just standing in a place that had suddenly been made available. That realization made it difficult to direct blame at them. Instead, most of my thoughts focused on something else entirely. Why it had happened. At first I looked for simple explanations. Attraction. Excitement. The kind of emotional rush people sometimes chase when life starts feeling predictable. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized the situation was a little more complicated than that. The person they had chosen wasn't just different. They represented something specific. Someone who hadn't yet lived through the same weight of responsibility. Someone who hadn't spent years building routines, solving problems, and making compromises that come with long-term relationships. Someone who still moved through life with a kind of lightness that fades as the years accumulate. I started to understand something uncomfortable. The affair hadn't really been about replacing me as a person. It had been about replacing what I represented. History. Responsibility. The passage of time itself. When you spend enough years building stability, you become connected to everything that comes with it. Bills that need paying. Schedules that need managing. Decisions that require patience instead of excitement. All the things that make life real. The person they chose didn't carry any of that history. They were new. And new things always feel lighter. They feel temporary in a way that's almost exciting. Because when something is new, it hasn't yet been tested by the ordinary pressures of life. That realization changed how I looked at the situation. I stopped seeing it as a competition between two people. It was never really about that. It was about escaping a version of life that had started to feel heavy. And choosing someone who still lived in a version of life that felt simple. But there's something important about simplicity. It rarely lasts. Eventually every relationship collects history. Responsibilities appear. Routine settles in. Time keeps moving. And when that happens, the same person who once represented escape can slowly start representing reality. The same way I eventually did. If you've ever experienced something like this, or watched someone chase novelty instead of history, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Take a moment to subscribe to Cheating Stories with Ray, like the video, and leave a comment sharing your perspective. Do people chase younger partners because of love? Or because they're trying to escape the version of life that reminds them time never stops moving? I don't think about them very often anymore. Time has a way of softening the sharp edges of things you once believed would break you completely. But one question still lingers. Was the betrayal really about love, or was it about escape? Because when someone chooses novelty over history, they're not just choosing a different person. They're choosing a different version of life. One that feels lighter, at least for a while. But sooner or later, every new beginning becomes routine. And when that happens, the same weight returns. If this story made you think, subscribe to Cheating Stories with Ray, like the video, and share it with someone who enjoys real, thought-provoking relationship stories.